A Russian vessel carrying grain arrived in Turkish waters after being rejected by Israel. This was not a story of bad logistics or a humanitarian crisis. It was a calculated move to deny the Assad regime a political victory. By refusing to accept the cargo, Israel broke a chain of supply designed to weaponize food against them. You are about to understand why a state would block food that could save lives and how this decision reshaped the strategic landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. To understand this incident, we must first discard the idea that international trade is driven purely by moral imperatives or simple humanitarian needs. In the realm of Realpolitik, every shipment is a potential vector for influence, and every port is a strategic node. When a vessel departs with grain labeled as humanitarian aid, the sender is often making a political statement as much as a logistical one. In this specific case, the grain was not merely food. It was a political asset, potentially stolen, moving from a Russian-controlled operation toward a destination that would validate the theft. The primary objective for the Russian and Syrian actors was not just to move calories. It was to prove that the blockade was ineffective and that the Assad regime could still access critical resources despite international pressure. Here is the thing that most observers miss. They see a ship and think of a boat. They see grain and think of food. But in this context, the ship is a political platform and the grain is a weaponized asset. The win condition for Russia and Syria was simple. If the ship docked, unloaded, and the grain entered the Syrian market, the narrative of the blockade would crumble. The Assad regime would claim a victory, regardless of the actual nutritional value of the cargo. The successful delivery would signal that the international community could be bypassed and that the economic strangulation of Syria had failed. This is a classic example of a supply chain integrity check. The cargo itself is secondary to the act of its delivery. Israel understood this dynamic perfectly. They recognized that accepting the grain would not solve a hunger crisis. It would solve a political problem for their adversaries. By refusing to unload the vessel, Israel was not being cruel. They were engaging in a strategy of reputation risk isolation. They chose to absorb the immediate logistical cost and the potential criticism of blocking food, rather than incurring the long-term strategic liability of legitimizing the theft narrative. This is a hard calculation. It prioritizes the integrity of the blockade over the optics of a single shipment. The importer's decision to refuse unloading demonstrates a clear understanding that the short-term pain of rejection is preferable to the long-term gain of the enemy. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. Now consider the concept of the win condition asymmetry. In this transaction, the two sides were playing different games. Russia and Syria were playing a game of political validation. Their goal was to cross the finish line and claim the win. Israel was playing a game of nullification. Their goal was to ensure the race never started. This creates a fascinating dynamic where the most successful outcome for the defender is not the destruction of the cargo, but the prevention of its arrival. The grain did not need to be sunk. It did not need to be destroyed. It simply needed to be stopped. This is a subtle but critical distinction in modern geopolitical conflict. The objective is not always total elimination of the threat. It is often the disruption of the threat's intended path. The refusal to accept the grain forced the adversary to activate a failover routing plan. When the primary political objective was blocked at the Israeli port, the ship did not turn back to Russia. It did not return to the sea empty. It moved to Turkey. This shift in destination reveals the adaptability of the adversary's supply chain. The economic value of the stolen grain was salvaged by finding a secondary market. However, this does not mean the strategy failed. By forcing the ship to Turkey, Israel ensured that the grain never reached Syria. The political victory was denied. The grain arrived, but not in the way the sender intended. The chain of custody was broken before the cargo could be weaponized against the Assad regime. This incident highlights the failure of the humanitarian narrative as a standalone defense mechanism. When state actors use moral framing to mask the strategic transfer of resources, they expect the recipient to react emotionally rather than strategically. They assume that the sight of starving people or the promise of food will override the strategic calculus. But in this case, the Israeli government and the local importer saw through the narrative. They recognized that the grain was not aid. It was a tool of statecraft designed to undermine a blockade. The moral framing was exploited to mask the strategic transfer of resources to an adversarial regime. When you treat humanitarian aid as a strategic asset, you must be prepared for the recipient to treat it as a strategic asset in return. The shift to Turkey also demonstrates the limits of unilateral action. Israel could stop the grain from reaching Syria, but they could not control where the grain went next. The ship found a new port. The economic value was recovered, but the strategic objective was thwarted. The Assad regime did not get the grain. The narrative of the blockade's failure was not validated. This is the essence of the win condition asymmetry. Israel achieved its optimal outcome not by destroying the grain, but by breaking the chain of custody before the cargo reached its final destination. The adversary had to settle for a partial recovery of value rather than a total political victory. This dynamic is not unique to this single incident. It reflects a broader pattern in modern conflict where supply chains are weaponized and trade is used as a tool of coercion. The grain was not just food, it was a signal, and by refusing to receive the signal, Israel sent a counter-signal of its own. They demonstrated that they would not be drawn into the adversary's narrative. They showed that they would prioritize strategic leverage over humanitarian optics. This is a hard lesson for policymakers who often struggle to balance moral imperatives with strategic realities. The choice to block the grain was not a moral failure, it was a strategic necessity. The failure of the humanitarian narrative to serve as a standalone defense mechanism is perhaps the most significant insight from this incident. It shows that in high-stakes geopolitical environments, moral framing can be exploited by state actors to mask the strategic transfer of resources. When you see a ship carrying aid, you must ask who benefits from its arrival, not just who suffers from its absence. The answer often reveals a deeper strategic game that is far more complex than the surface-level humanitarian story suggests. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.